he proceeded to park the airplane, set the parking brake, unbuckle his seatbelt and shoulder harness, and climb out and leave the airplane running with me in it. Oh, man.
The guaranteed way to do poorly on your check ride is to show up unprepared without the materials you need, with no ACS and no familiarization with the ACS, and with an attitude that says the DPE's got to perform up to my standards. That's not the way this works. Mr. Brown, always good to see you, but we actually weren't scheduled to do anything today, but there was a scheduling change in one of our lives. Would you like to explain that a little bit?
Oh, just a little bit. So I had an interesting, instrument. I had an instrument, rented lips, Jamie, that don't work well in midday.
I have a similar problem. It might be age related.
That's right. So cut. Here we go again. You don't have to cut it. Anyway, yeah, I had an instrument check ride scheduled for this morning. In the last several days here in Houston, we've had, the TAFs haven't really been right for the last 2 or 3 days, but today we were supposed to have broken somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 feet and 6 or more statute miles visibility. Well, this time of year, Mexican farmers are burning off the remnants of last year's crops. And of course, that smoke has to go somewhere. And when the atmospheric conditions are right, that smoke is sucked up here into South Texas. So for the last several days, we've had between 4 and 6 miles visibility, even though towards the end of the day, we actually have partly sunny skies. So we had an instrument check ride scheduled today, and I'm thinking, okay, well, it's an instrument check ride. That'll be fine. We'll file and we'll go, because we'll be VFR, not in the clouds, but we've got visibility issues. So we get down, we get through the oral just fine, and I said, okay, so you ready to go fly? And he said, well, let me check the weather. And sure enough, we had about 2,900 feet broken or something like that, which is perfectly fine for what we needed to do. But we had 3 miles visibility reported by the METAR. And interestingly enough, during a part of the check ride, we were talking about his personal minimums, because if you pass an instrument check ride today, legally speaking, you could go out and fly in horrible weather down to minimums tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
And so when he was talking about his personal minimums, he was saying 1,000 feet and 6 miles visibility to start with, and he'd gradually work down to less visibility. So I found it interesting that despite the fact we could have gone today and it would have been perfectly fine, we just filed and it would have been perfectly fine. He chose to adhere to his personal minimum of 6 miles visibility and called a discontinuance on the check ride. So, I think we could have gone, but what I think is irrelevant, because it was his check ride and he didn't feel comfortable under the given circumstances, and it was outside his personal minimum. So what that's telling me is that when he does pass his check ride, and I guarantee you at some point he will, with that kind of attitude, he's going to be a safe instrument pilot, because he didn't let the pressure of having a DPE sitting across the table from him, who basically said, well, we could go. Mm-hmm. And he held to his personal minimums. And good on him. I left that room feeling like when we do get back together again, and when he does pass his check ride, he's going to be a good instrument pilot and a safe one.
It brings to mind, there is a real link between judgment, attitude, and behavior. And really, when you go on a check ride, that's what DPEs are looking for. You're pilot in command. You're acting as if I'm just a passenger. Yeah, I'm telling you what I want you to do, but you're in command of this, and having the wherewithal and the confidence to get through the oral, but say, I'd like a discontinuance because this doesn't meet my standards. I think that's a noble choice. That just says, I have my limits. I know what they are. Right. It's kind of like when I started flying tail dragger, I've always said, my limit was 10 knots of wind within 30 degrees of runway heading, because I knew I could handle that, and I'll get better from there. But, the flip side of that, Pat, is judgment, attitude, and behavior can go negative too. And people can just really get into a situation where they drive themselves into disapproval on a check ride just because of the way they're behaving.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit before we actually hit the record button, but one particular experience, there's several of them we'll talk about, but one particular experience, and it didn't have to happen. It was a commercial check ride. This is several years ago. It was a commercial check ride. Nice young man, flying the airplane quite well, had done well on the oral, and well on the way to passing the check ride. Not just passing it, but really acing it. And it came time to do a particular maneuver, and he said, um, I he asked me, "How do you want me to do this?" I think is the question. How do you want me to do this maneuver? Well, we're mandated not to instruct in any way, shape, or form. We can lose our jobs if
Mhm.
we are found to be giving flight instruction in the cockpit. So my response was, "Well, you're the PIC." He said, he said, "Well," he said, I'm not sure what to do, or something to that effect." And I said, "Well, what does the ACS say?" And he was real quiet for a minute. And I said, "Did you read the ACS?" And he kind of sheepishly acknowledged no. And I said, "Well, if you want to pull it out of your flight bag, I mean, I'll take the controls for a minute if you want to pull it out of your flight bag." And he said, I don't own one. I don't
Mm.
own I'm on a check ride, and I don't own an ACS.
Yeah, especially, when the organization prints out the test for you, it really does behoove you to review it and be familiar with it and have that with you just in case something comes up, because you are allowed to open a book on a check ride.
Absolutely right. You're allowed to do that. No question about it. I think we're entitling this thing "Epic Check Ride Fails." Um, and I don't want to get into the cliches of common errors, because not being able to hold headings and altitudes. I mean, that's something that happens frequently. We're talking about the stuff that really there's no wiggle room. It's black and white.
Well, it brings me to mind of when I was in flight school. I did my commercial single and multi-engine check rides with this great guy, Bryant Bauslog. He was a million years old. He was out of Orlando exec. His dad had owned a grass strip in the 20s. I mean, he was great. I liked him. I passed both my rides with him just fine. I found him to be a really interesting guy who had
Yeah.
a really good demeanor in the airplane. I felt very confident flying with him. But I had a fellow student who took a check ride with him a few days later, single commercial, and busted. And the reason was, and you'll have to correct me, they probably changed the name of this, but it was an emergency descent where you do 360-degree power off turns and land the airplane. And he didn't do it well. He did like 3.5 turns or something. He wasn't lined up with the runway. And the applicant, my fellow student, said, "Let me give that a try again." And Bauslag was like, "No, this isn't practice."
Yeah.
And it's that thing where he got into this, like, taking it personally. It's like, no, it's written down. You do it the way it says.
Yeah, yeah. That requirement has changed a little bit, but the point of your story is absolutely accurate. It's a one and done. You don't get a second chance. It isn't practice. I was doing a check ride a while back. Again, this dates back several years. And if I have to touch the controls, if I have to touch the controls to save the airplane, and I'm not talking about, "Would you take the controls, please, while I put on my foggles or while I take
Mhm.
off my hood," or whatever. No problem there. If I have to actually touch the controls to save the airplane, the check ride's over. Period.
That
And
seems very fair, by the way.
yeah, you think so? Lack of mastery of the aircraft is an issue. So anyway, I was a nice young man, again, had done pretty well on his oral, although he had a little bit of an attitude. Um, he still did pretty well on the oral. I said, "Okay, well, let's go out and let's fly the airplane." And he really did fly the airplane quite well, but this was kind of a situation where the crosswind was a little stronger than what I think he anticipated, and we came into land, and he lost control of the airport airplane on the runway, and we were headed towards running off the 75-foot wide runway, and I ended up having to literally take the airplane away from him to save us from running off into the grass and damaging the airplane. Well, I mean that's a bust. I mean there's just no way around it. That's a bust. I had a similar situation um, with another student. This was really just a month or two ago. We were coming back into a towered field, and this particular student got a little disoriented, and almost we came within 10 seconds probably of busting the class Delta airspace. I had to step in and say, "Turn left now," and which and the applicant did. And well, I had to step in. I didn't have to touch the airplane, but I had to tell the applicant what to do and to do it now, because I cannot let them bust. I can't let them bust a reg.
Mm-hmm.
Had a similar situation on the same airport where the applicant was climbing out, and we're underneath a shelf of Class Bravo airspace, and the applicant just seemed um, uh, oblivious to the fact that we were getting close to 3,000 feet. So we got to about 2980, and I said, "Level off now." And of course, he jams the wheel. We didn't bust the Bravo, but I'm absolutely certain we would have if I hadn't stepped in. So those kind of things, those are they're mental mistakes, and I totally get it. They're mental mistakes. That's different than maybe not being quite sure on the oral. I don't know. Maybe some sort of detail on the oral that's not
A
terribly.
regulatory question or something like that, an
Yeah,
airspeed restriction or an
yeah,
altitude. Yeah,
yeah.
I get that.
That's different. And then the same student, the one that almost busted the class Delta, um, I said to her, let's just go ahead and do a soft field landing, kind of check that off the list, because we're going to have to fly again, but we can at least check that off the list. And so the tower told her to enter a downwind, and then told her to extend her downwind by a mile and then turn base. Well, she started to turn immediately, and I had to step in again and tell her, "Well, what are you doing?" and direct her. And I should have just called it at that point and said, "All right, let's just land." But she was set up for a soft field at that point, and the approach was actually going quite well. And she rounded out, ballooned just a little bit, and instead of adding just a smidgen of power to soften the touchdown, she added way too much. We ballooned more. She yanked it back. We landed hard, and the tower told her to make a turnoff on the very next intersection, which was very close to where we were, and we were still going probably 40 knots or something like that. And she attempted to make the turn, and so the airplane kind of goes up on two wheels.
Yeah, they don't do well with sharp maneuvering on the
No.
ground.
And I mean, I immediately, my airplane, and jumped on the brakes. Probably left half the tires on the runway, but we avoided running off onto the grass, and through a little maneuvering, we were actually able to make that first turnoff. But again, it's a situation where unfortunately I had to touch the airplane, and without predetermined reasons, and it ended up being a bust. Didn't have to be, but it just.
And admittedly, Pat, this is a minority of applicants. Most
Oh
people come
yes,
in well prepared. Everybody comes in nervous. Some
yeah,
people react better to that than others. But the goal is for the applicant to be prepared to act as PIC. And this kind of brings me back to years ago. I was down at the local airport getting ready to go flying. And there's a guy there just ripping because he had flown down to some other airport down south for his instrument check ride. And he was so angry because he had to pay for it, but he didn't even get to do the oral. And he's just so angry. And I got him in a conversation. This fella had shown up for his check ride, an airplane owner. And I'm sorry to say, sometimes that affects people's thought process. But he went down with an airplane. That's all. No hood, no foggles, no approach plates, no charts, no nothing. And just figured the DPE would supply all that. And no, they're checking your ability to be PIC. They're not your instructor, they're your examiner. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes, I don't know if this is arrogance or attitude on the part of the applicant, or if it's a lacking on the part of the CFI that didn't prepare somebody. This is what your check ride's going to be like. And I always used to do mock orals with my students. And, by the time we get to the end of training, I was just an annoyance in the cockpit. I wasn't helping them at all. I was creating problems to see how they would handle distractions. But sometimes I think people go off, and maybe the CFI has not fully prepared them for what this experience is.
Well, and that certainly could be the case, and I'm sure it is the case in some instances. Your story about the person showing up without anything but the airplane really kind of segues into kind of the granddaddy of them all in terms of epic Checkride Fails, which really kind of prompted this episode, actually. And this was just a few days ago. I was at a particular airport, and the oral had been discontinued 6 weeks prior because the applicant just didn't feel like he was doing very well, and so he just said, "Could we discontinue?" It's okay. So we get together, and by the way, when you have a discontinuance, you have 60 days to finish it. So we get together 5 days before the 60-day limit to finish this up, and we're getting through the oral, and it was I'm being kind to say it was adequate, but it's okay. Let's get to the airplane and show me your stuff. So we got in the airplane, we're taxiing out, and I don't know what prompted me to say this because I normally don't ask the question, but do you have your foggles or your hood? And he looked at me like I had three eyes and said, no. Okay. So my response was, well, how can we do the check ride without your foggles or a hood? There's an instrument part of this check ride, and he said, well, my flight instructor always had them with him. I said, well, but I'm not your flight instructor. I said, what do you want to do? And that kind of prompted about a 30-second circular conversation about, well, I don't have my foggles. Okay, what are you going to do? Well, my flight instructor provided them. I understand that, but what are you going to do? Over and over again. And finally said, did you expect that I was going to supply the foggles for you? Well, yes, because my flight instructor always did. So what does the ACS say? Well, I haven't memorized the ACS. Nobody said you had to memorize it. Just what does the ACS say about that? It's on the ACS. Anyway, so this goes on and on, as you can imagine. Finally, he calls the ground control and says he wants taxi back to the flight school, which we did. And he proceeded to park the airplane, set the parking brake, unbuckle his seatbelt and shoulder harness, and climb out and leave the airplane running with me in it.
Wow.
Oh, man.
That's not a good sign.
I was stunned. I thought I had seen almost everything that I could see. I was stunned. And I was so stunned. I said, what? Anyway, I shut the engine down and gathered my stuff and got out of the airplane. And by that time, he was walking back to the airplane. I just said over to him, the check ride's over. And we went in and we had a conversation about this. And he actually had the nerve to get angry at me because he didn't have his hood, and that I busted him because nobody ever told him he shouldn't get out of the airplane and leave the engine running.
Yeah, because that requires special instruction. I'm sorry, that's a no-brainer. Everybody should know that.
This is absolutely true, and I'm just looking at him, and I mean, I don't even know what to say at that point. And there's a little bit more to the story in terms of the conversation, but the bottom line is that you just don't get out of an airplane with the motor running. Now, if he had said to me, will you hold the brakes while I go
Hmm.
get the
Yeah,
foggles?
if there was some communication between the two parties in the airplane, that's a completely different thing than just getting out.
And I say this because, first of all, it didn't happen, but had he said that, I probably would have said something like, "Are you sure it's a good idea to leave the engine running?" or something along those lines, just to respond to the fact that he did make the effort.
Mhm.
Would you mind holding the brakes? But not to have any conversation about it. And in the room afterwards, he was trying to say, "Well, you're a DPE. I assumed you'd have the brakes."
Assume
Well,
is the key word there.
yeah. And 61.47, you make fun of me for knowing these regs, but 61.47 says that in a check ride situation, he, in this case, is pilot in command. That's what PIC stands for, not passenger in crisis. So he can't, he couldn't, he can't, he shouldn't ever rely on the person in the right seat, whoever it is, to make the decisions of PIC.
Absolutely, by regulation, and I'm not making fun of you. I revere your genius. I'm serious. You have a tremendous grasp of this stuff. I always thought I was a pretty good researcher, but you're better than I am. And
Well,
it's not always the student. And well, let me segue into this. I'll tell you the story of my worst check ride ever, and it was horrible. But there's three possible outcomes. We can successfully complete the check ride.
yep,
We can unsuccessfully complete the check ride, which means we
right,
have to come back, or we can ask for a discontinuance.
yep,
And that could be a whole variety of things. I don't feel good. The weather turned while we were doing the oral. That's not a shameful thing. And I'm not sure that many applicants understand they can do that, because I have seen people bust because they go out with the examiner and get in the airplane in conditions they have no business being in the airplane,
yeah.
but we booked the time, so they go. But I digress. This is my worst flight check story, and maybe it's because it's me. The problem wasn't me, Pat.
Uh-huh.
It's my multi-engine instructor ride. I'm doing it on a grass strip down in South Florida in a Piper Seminole. So an instructor and I flew down in the Seminole because my school wouldn't let a student fly, even though I'm rated for it, commercially rated. I'm not allowed to fly the airplane solo. I fly down with an instructor. We go do the oral in this little outbuilding at the examiner's home. He lives on this grass strip. And it's a normal multi-engine instructor check ride. It takes a while because I did my instrument instructor first, then my multi-engine, then my CFI. So it was a pretty extensive oral. But while we're talking, this is summer in Florida, there's just a torrential rain that's just pounding down on this grass strip outside. We finally finished the oral. It's still raining. We have to sit there for another hour or so while it's raining. So comfortable, Pat, to be
Oh,
sitting
yeah.
with an examiner that you're not really clicking with under
Yeah.
tough
I
circumstances.
get it. I get it.
And I've been gone for hours. He doesn't want us using his bathroom. It was really unpleasant. So finally, it gets time. The rain stops, and we go out to do the ride. And he says he'll do the takeoff because the field is wet now, but this is his home field. He's got it. My instructor's in the back. I'm in the right seat. The examiner's in the left seat. Got out on the field. It's mushy. There's standing water every place. I don't love this, but what are you going to do? He advances the throttle. We start rolling down the runway, and there's clumps of grass and mud and water and crap flying all over the place. And I'm not kidding you. The examiner has got the throttles forward, going, "Come on, baby. Come on, baby." He realizes, I don't know, maybe 500 feet before the end of the field, we're not going to leave the ground. It's not going to happen. He chops the throttles, hits the brakes, slides off the end of the runway, and the airplane sinks.
Oh, no.
There will be no check ride today. He had to put us up in a hotel. It was horrible. I had to go out with the instructor in the morning and literally dig the airplane out, haul it up onto a hard pad, wash it all off to get all the crap out, and then fly it over to Vero Beach, a paved surface with the gear down when we went, just to make sure it came down again. We got it over to Vero, and I took my check ride the next day, but it was absolutely horrible. So it's not always the applicant. Sometimes there's other issues.
That's an awesome story.
There's probably a book in there someplace, but it is memorable. And that instructor is a United captain today. We're still good friends. Every time we see each other, we relive that story.
Well, I mean, first of all, today the instructor would not have been allowed in the back seat. That's number one. But number two, today the instructor, the examiner, would absolutely not be allowed to do the takeoff. Now that probably was the case back then.
Yeah,
But
I don't think this was entirely on the up and up.
yeah, you think?
But I'm not going to turn myself in and give back my ticket.
I swear
I
one of these
earned
days.
that, Pat.
Yes, you
It was rough going.
Yes, you did. Yeah, I swear one of these days I'm gonna write a book about all of this. And one chapter will be about the guy that told me that the engine would continue to run if the battery and alternator died as long as there was magneto fluid in the engine.
There you go. You can never have too much magneto fluid.
I didn't know that. I learned something that day that magneto fluid is what makes the engine run. And I also learned that in a different check ride a while back that the alternator belt is what turns the propeller to make the airplane go forward.
Well,
And
there you go.
there are a lot of things mechanically about the airplane that I thought I knew that I turned out as I was wrong. So
Well, maybe the dumbest thing I ever heard, and this is an A&P thing, I heard an A&P student ask an A&P instructor, is a vortex generator an AC or a DC device? And the instructor said, I'll get back to you. I got to go look that up. So, hey, the point is we're human. We get nervous. We do goofy stuff. But the guaranteed way to do poorly on your check ride is to show up unprepared without the materials you need, with no ACS and no familiarization with the ACS, and with an attitude that says the DPE's got to perform up to my standards. That's not the way this works.
yeah, that's probably the most succinct way to put this at the end of the day. And just try not to do something just boneheaded. Little mistakes are those things happen. I fully expect when I get into an airplane with an applicant, and I tell them this before we even turn on the engine. I say, you're going to make mistakes today. You will make mistakes in the oral. You're going to make mistakes in the air. I guarantee it. I'll put money on it. But fix those mistakes. If you're not sure of a question on the oral, I'm not sure, but I know where to find the answer. Go look it up. If you make a mistake in the air, to paraphrase Taylor Swift, shake it off. And
You're ahead of me. I can't name a single Taylor Swift song.
well, that's probably the only one I can name, but it's true. You have to focus on. Somebody said the other day, and I'm trying to remember who said it to me, but what's behind you won't kill you. What's ahead of you will.
Mm-hmm.
And I wish I could remember who said that to me, but I thought, man, that's something I've got to remember and steal, because it's true. What happened behind you isn't going to kill you. What happens ahead of you will. And so if you make a mistake on a check ride, fess up, even critique what you could have done differently, and move on to the next thing, because
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No,
That's
no.
something I've been telling people for years, and I've had some pushback on it, but I genuinely believe it to be true. I use the example of a steep turn. The DPE says I'd like to see a steep turn, so I clear the area. I do my prep. I roll into my steep turn, and let's say I'm 180 degrees around the turn, private check ride, and I see I'm 150 feet low. Instead of sweating about it, I point to my altimeter and say to the DPE, see how I'm low on this? I'm going to roll out some bank, bring in some back pressure. Then I'm going to roll the bank back in, and that corrects me back up. I'm within the plus or minus 100 feet now. That's how you correct that. The DPE doesn't know, did I just screw up, or did I demonstrate a screw up to show how to fix it? Either way, I acted as pilot in command throughout the entire thing. I'll defer to your greatness, but I really believe that's an acceptable situation.
Well, first of all, you screwed up. So
Yeah, you got to admit it.
there's no doubt about that. And I'm going to notice. I'm not going to say anything because I can't.
Mhm.
But if the applicant notices and says correcting,
Mhm.
I'm trending low or some words to that effect. I'm low correcting. They don't have to say I'm rolling out the bank or I don't care what they say but if they say correcting and they fix it, then it will probably be a debrief item, but that's all. But now, if that kind of thing is happening over and over and over and over again, that's a different situation.
Well, and you've pointed this out in the past. That's actually in the ACS. Towards the back, it does say exceeding standards is not a bust. Consistently missing standards is.
Yes. And so correcting something when you're off shows me that you're paying attention to what's going on. You recognize that things are wrong and you're going to correct them. That's a good thing, not a bad thing, as long as it's not happening over and over and over again and just establishing a pattern of basically sloppiness.
I think we've provided a real resource to viewers, whether they're getting ready to take a check ride or whether they're going to go on a flight review in the coming days, whatever it is. This is the way not to behave and not to prepare for your check ride. And it suggests, Pat, there should be a follow-on episode we do on how do you set yourself up for success with a check ride, because there are some very simple things you can do that lower your stress and improve your chances dramatically.
I think we should do that for the next one.
I'm into it. Until then, viewers, click the like button. I'm not telling you have to. I'm just saying we would really appreciate it. Leave a comment below if you've ever had a horrible check ride, if you fear a horrible check ride, or if you took a check ride with the guy I did who plowed up the farmer's field on a takeoff. And of course, subscribe to the channel because Pat and I are such lonely people. We really need friends. So please come on board with us. And we'll see you back here next time with the genius of Pat Brown and the adorable cherubic face of Jamie Beckett right here on MadPropsAero.
Adios.